On April 1st, 2014, two young women from the Netherlands stepped onto a trail in the little town of Boquete, Panama. And with that, one of the most bizarre, convoluted, and apparently inexplicable missing persons cases in the history of the Americas began. If you've seen part 1 of this series, and if you haven't, don't worry because I'm going to do a quick recap, then you know that Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon should have returned home without issue on that night. But when they still weren't back with their host family the following evening, everyone at the little Spanish language school where they were studying became concerned that something must have gone terribly wrong. But nobody knew what. Or did they? In our first episode on this case, we covered the story as it's typically been known to the general public, which for Americans is mostly drawn from the work of Daily Beast journalist Jeremy Kritz. The way that story goes is that Kris and Lisanne got to Boquete in late March, spent a few days in town, ran into some trouble with their volunteering plans, and then disappeared without a trace while out on a hike. And all without telling anyone where they planned to go. Over the following weeks, the Panamanian authorities managed to narrow the search area to the Pianista Trail on the northwest edge of town, which leads up to the Continental Divide at a place referred to as the Mirador. But beyond that, their efforts began to look fruitless. If the girls had gotten lost out there, then it had almost certainly happened on the portion of the trail east of the ridge, where the route is no longer maintained by the Panamanian National Park Service. There, the path is worn by generations of natives as they've traveled between Boquete and the little indigenous village of Alto Romero, as well as the scattered little ranches and farms out and about in that area. And this is a formidable place for those unaccustomed to its various twists and turns, the steel cable river crossings, and the many false trails leading only into oblivion, and not the fun one. And the girls had wandered right into that world without telling anyone where to look in case they didn't come back. It comes as no surprise, then, that by the end of April, the government had all but abandoned the hunt, preferring to take a more supervisory and logistics-based role as private teams and Dutch investigators took the lead on the ground. In the end, however, it was neither the Panamanians nor the Dutch who located the first true clue as to the fates of Kris and Lisanne. It was the natives. About halfway through June, a little over 2 months after the girls went missing, an indigenous woman from the village of Alto Romero contacted authorities in Boquete to report that she had found a backpack in the Sanguinola River, about 2 miles west of the settlement. Inside, she'd found a pair of bras, 2 pairs of sunglasses, about $88 in cash, 2 cell phones in water-damaged but recoverable condition, and a Canon PowerShot SX270HS, a 16GB SanDisk memory card, and, most identifiably, Lisanne Froon's passport. Ever since the girls were first reported missing, the Panamanians had believed Kris and Lisanne to be victims of foul play. Now, they had in their hands the evidence of a crime, in the form of a backpack found in a river in a place where the girls never should have been. And soon after, renewed efforts in the area, conducted in large part by the local Nagobe people, started turning up more evidence. Searchers found boots, a small number of scattered yet unmarred bones, and even a pair of shorts. All of it in or just outside of the river, and as far as 4 miles upstream from where the backpack was reportedly recovered. Meanwhile, digital forensics experts in the Netherlands worked to extract and analyze the data from the cell phones and the pictures from the camera, only to realize that something was very wrong with the information they'd been working with since early April. Throughout the first 2 months of the case, several witnesses had reported seeing the girls making their way up the Pianista Trail around 1 in the afternoon, which should have placed them at the Mirador and proper turnaround point for tourists around 3 o'clock p.m. When the Dutch National Forensics Institute examined the digital breadcrumbs left behind by the internal calendars and clocks of the phones and cameras, however, they discovered that the witness timeline differed from the electronically recorded one by a full 2 hours. People living and working along the trail said they saw the girls begin their hike an hour after noon, but the Cannon saw them at the trailhead an hour before the sun reached its zenith, at 11 o'clock in the morning. Not only that, but there was a rather large gap between the last time someone unlocked one of the phones on April 5th and the last time the camera was used on April 8th. The deeper they looked, the more confusing that gap began to appear, because at least 2 of the pictures taken in the early hours of April 8th depict what appear to be the back of Kris Kremers' head and what looks like it might be Lisanne Froon's jawline. That was weird enough on its own, since the rest of the publicly available photos from that night are dark, grainy shots of the forest, and probably taken near the river, But what made it even stranger was the fact that, so far as the camera's timestamp was concerned, not one picture had been taken between April 1st and April 8th, suggesting that at least one, potentially both of the girls, were alive for at least a week, despite having no food, no way to purify water, and no wilderness experience. Add to that the fact that, according to the data recovered from the phone, the last time one of the phones turned on was a full 3 days later, on April 11th, and you get the impression that somehow they survived for nearly 2 weeks. And yet, despite the fact that the pictures and the location of Kris's shorts would imply that the girls were close to or even on the trail for the majority of that time period, they somehow never managed to find their way back up to the Mirador, nor did anyone searching the trails come across them. The whole thing screamed foul play, which was what the Panamanian government was saying from the beginning, but then something very peculiar happened. Rather than taking the fact that the bones were scattered, but also totally free from any scavenging marks, while the camera and cell phones, the latter of which were in plastic bags when recovered, even though Kris and Lisanne were not known to store them that way, had minimal physical damage, as did everything in the backpack, including the backpack itself, as a sign that someone had staged the remains, both the Panamanian government and the head of the Dutch task force concluded that the girls had simply gotten lost and then fallen into the river. Worse still, the independent experts Krit brought in to give opinions on the investigation agreed with that position. Until they didn't, even though the new information which supposedly led them to change their minds was almost entirely inconsequential to whatever happened to Kris and Lisanne. In other words, they were just kind of saving face. Needless to say, many people were and are disappointed with the outcome of the investigation, and as a result of that dissatisfaction, in the years since the disappearance, more and more information has come to light, and largely through open source intelligence, which is the practice of collecting, analyzing, and producing actionable intelligence from publicly available information. As more and more files from the investigation have leaked, those with the time and passion have taken it upon themselves to compile and analyze them. One such individual, who goes by Scarlet R online, has managed to put just about everything anyone has ever learned about this case into one blog, which is called Coup de Casse, and it was through reading her work that I came to understand just how convoluted this story really is, and why it is that, to this day, nobody can say for certain what happened to the lost Dutch girls. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. When you're out on the trails, it's important to wear the right kind of clothes for your environment. And as we move into the warmer months of the year, that means things that are lightweight, breathable, and for when you make it back to camp, comfortable. So if you're the outdoorsy type, this would be a great time to check out our sponsor for today's episode, Fabletics. In 2014, Fabletics set out to revolutionize the athletic wear industry by combining the pinnacle of form and function, blending a unique fashion sense with an obsession for quality to create the ultimate luxury athletic wear. Fabletics provides a wide range of optimized clothing for both men and women, with soft and durable but high-performance materials featuring bold prints and colors, all at an affordable price point. Plus, the moisture-wicking quick-dry material, hint hint, wink wink, features internal and external pockets to provide a flexible but supportive base for all of your active needs. Personally, I love these things. They're soft, they are comfortable, and they can be worn for just about any situation I'm in. I could wear this shirt to go hiking, I could wear this shirt to go to an event, I could wear this shirt just hanging around the house, and I'm going to be comfortable. The same goes for the pants, the jackets, the socks even, which I didn't want to take my shoes off to put them on for this. Also, I wasn't going to show you my feet for free. Even socked. And to be honest, I wear my Fabletics green just pants entirely too often. Like I said in the past, we try our best to only advertise things to you that we genuinely use and enjoy and appreciate, so this is one of those products that, without a single doubt in my mind, I can say, this is good. Use it. And with our exclusive link, you can get access to the VIP intro offer, which includes up to 80% off your first order, up to 50% off all products after that, and access to VIP-only sales each month when you sign up to become a new Fabletics VIP. This also includes an additional member credit if you wish to shop for a given month, allowing your VIP payment to unlock a bundle kit or any item up to $100. So, if you would like to give Fabletics a try and become a VIP member, check out our link in the description below. On March 15, 2014, 22-year-old Kris Kremers and 21-year-old Lisanne Froon left Amsterdam, Netherlands, on a plane bound for San Jose, Costa Rica. The pair flew United Airlines, and after a layover in Houston, they arrived in the little Central American nation. But this was not their final destination. From the Costa Rican capital, they took a bus to Bocas del Toro and then a boat to Isla Colón, where they planned to spend a couple of weeks soaking in the local Panamanian culture and taking a crash course in Spanish before heading up into the mountains for the remainder of their time in the country. Though the primary purposes of their trip were to learn Spanish and do some volunteering, their stay on the island was more of an acclimation period. In other words, a vacation. Kris and Lisanne spent their 2 weeks on the island, splitting their time between tourism and learning Spanish at a local live-in school called Spanish by the Sea, which was part of the Spanish at Locations franchise. Both girls wrote about their first couple of weeks in their diaries, Lisanne more frequently than Kris, and based on both of their accounts, it looks as though they were generally having a great time on Isla Colón. Lisanne's entries over the course of their first week in Bocas are very high energy and emotive, with sections covering the tropical weather, the scenery, the social atmosphere, and the Caribbean culture of the eastern coast of Panama, all of which was apparently quite pleasing to her. What was not so pleasing was Spanish class, which she refers to as pretty complicated in her entry for March 19th. Though she did make a point to sprinkle newly learned Spanish words and phrases throughout the page, and said that she was beginning to recognize various bits and pieces of conversations that she heard going on around her. Overall, her writing is incredibly upbeat, filled with exclamation marks, and primarily focused on where they went, who they talked to, and what they did. But the same is not exactly true of Kris, who was far more matter-of-fact in her entries. She doesn't come across as unhappy, necessarily, just a bit more direct. I guess a good way to put it is that Lisanne's reads like a stream of consciousness, while Kris's writing reads as more thought out. That said, both girls recorded essentially the same things up until March 25th, which was the first day they spent apart since arriving in Panama. According to Lisanne's diary, Kris began feeling unwell on the 24th, but stuck it out for the various activities they had planned for that day. On the 25th, however, Lisanne wrote that Kris felt very unwell and decided to stay in bed all day. Kris's account, though not conflicting, is more detailed. It is Tuesday around 10 o'clock in the morning, she writes, and I should actually take classes, but I am sick. After having had a nervous stomach, or gippy tummy, for 3 days, it finally all came out today. She referred to this as super lame, but took the opportunity to record all that had happened since her last entry on the 20th, all of which lines up with what Lisanne had written about the same time period. The entries for March 25th are the last ones either girl recorded while in Bocas del Toro, but there's no indication into why that is. Whatever the case, they arrived in Boquete on Saturday, March 29th, where they planned to stay with a local woman, continue their studies, and work at a local daycare, with that last part being the main goal. And that's important to understand, that the primary objective of the trip was the volunteering. Learning Spanish was kind of secondary and also necessary. Tourism was totally an aside. So, all of that said, Lisanne wrote in her diary that they left Bocas at 10 a.m. and arrived in Boquete 4 hours later, and Kris noted that the journey actually went very well, with great appreciation for the fact that the small bus even had air conditioning. Their first order of business once they got into town was to check in with Spanish by the River, the sister school of their program in Bocas, and home base for the remainder of their time in Panama. Kris wrote that they found the school in no time, even though they had to get out earlier than the other people on the bus, in a place she described as almost in the middle of nowhere. After that, they made their way over to the home of Miriam Guerra, a Boquete local who often rented to international students staying in the region for extended periods of time. There wasn't much to the accommodations, just 2 beds and a makeshift desk or table with a folding chair, but it was clean and convenient, and they had access to the rest of the house. Though exhausted by the day's travel and a little uncomfortable about the idea of staying with a host family from a completely different culture, Kris was optimistic about their next month and a half. Once we've stayed here for a while, I'm sure that it will be all right, she wrote, adding that the family is very sweet. For Lisanne, however, there was something deeply nerve-wracking about the entire experience. I'm sitting here with tears in my eyes and rolling down my cheeks, she wrote in her March 29th diary entry. I had no problems for 2 weeks, and suddenly I went completely crazy. She attributed the change to the transition from 2 weeks of lively holiday to stepping into the life of a real Panamanian family, and said that she was way too naive in thinking that she could handle the situation she now found herself in. Most interestingly, she explicitly said, I didn't really want this, but I went anyway. Still, a good night of sleep and a bit more time to get comfortable seems to have done her well enough, as Lisanne's entry from the following day suggests a much more chipper attitude. Though she says she still felt like a tiny intruder in this family, she was delighted by the host family's hospitality, the local scenery, and of course, how cheap everything was. As of 2025, the average Panamanian salary is around $16,000, which is different from the Netherlands. Both girls would end their entries for March 30th in much the same way, though with significantly different connotations to their wording. Where Lisanne, perhaps trying to hype herself up, wrote, "Tomorrow is our first day in Ora." Guarderia Ora is the daycare they were supposed to work at. So she said, "Tomorrow's our first day in Ora. Exciting." Chris's entry, on the other hand, concluded with a much more apprehensive, "Tomorrow we will start at Ora. Very curious how that will go." And from this point onward, the timeline is much more difficult to explain. We know that on Monday, March 31st, Kris and Lisanne were supposed to start work at Guarderia Ora, but things didn't go to plan. Writing in her diary about the day, Lisanne was very clearly unhappy about the situation. Writing, "Yuck, yuck, yuck, our first day was a disaster." She went on to explain that when they arrived at the daycare, they were not even recognized or given a friendly welcome, and the only thing anyone said to them was "no próxima semana." They didn't have work for them until next week. Kris was equally frustrated and also a bit more detailed. "When we arrived," she wrote, "we introduced ourselves expecting the woman to know who we were because she was expecting us, after all. Instead, she found that the owner, Maria, showed no sign of recognition and said that it was not possible now to start volunteer work there, and that they should come back the next week." Like Lisanne, she noted how Maria was cold and unfriendly and expressed confusion about the situation. Recognizing that there was nothing they could do about the situation, the two girls returned to Spanish by the River, through which they'd planned the whole trip, hoping for some answers, but they didn't find any there either. "The school also found it strange," Kris went on, "because we had planned it months in advance. The coordinator at the school, Marjolaine, said that she was certain she'd confirmed the arrangements just 2 days earlier, but Guarderia Ora wouldn't budge, so they set about looking for another place for Kris and Lisanne to work. Their best bet was another local school, Casa Esperanza, which Marjolaine spent the remainder of the day trying to contact. Kris, judging by her diary, was hopeful about that opportunity as well, and remarked that if they liked Casa Esperanza, they'd just stay there the whole time and give up on working with Guarderia Ora. "Let's hope that the other project is really fun," she wrote, before finishing the day's entry with, "Well, let's go with the Panamanian flow then." Those would be the last words she ever wrote down. One of the most difficult things about working on this case is the lack of publicly available materials from the initial police investigation. But back in July of 2025, Scarlett from Boquete obtained access to the case files for the Lost Dutch Girls, and included amongst the materials she received were copies of direct witness testimony that I have not seen anywhere else on the internet. Though she didn't post copies of the files themselves, her summary and analysis of their contents is equal parts enlightening and confusing. One of the first people to formally speak to police was Miriam Guerra, the host mother with whom the girls were supposed to be staying throughout the month, though one source suggested they were going to move into a hostel at some point in the near future, which I find interesting. Anyway, sitting down with police on April 4th at 2:30 p.m., the first question they asked her was if she knew Kris and Lisanne, and if she did, were they friends, enemies, or family? Based on the wording and the fact that every single person involved appears to have been asked this question, I'm going to assume that this somewhat oddly worded inquiry was more about disposition than actual relationship. Naturally, Kris and Lisanne didn't qualify as friend, enemy, or family, so Miriam just told them that she knew them because they were staying in her home. Beyond that, though, there wasn't much she could tell them. The girls had arrived on March 29th, but she'd barely gotten to know them by the time they disappeared. According to their own diaries, both Kris and Lisanne felt a little uncomfortable their first night, and neither spoke much Spanish. They'd spent most of Sunday exploring the town, and Monday they'd gone into work only to be turned away, so the only time they had spent all together, for all intents and purposes, were the nights of 29th, the 30th, and the 31st. Miriam hadn't even seen them on Tuesday, even though she waited up for them until 10 o'clock that night, and in another interview, this one with the press on April 8th, Guerra explained that the girls, whom she described as calm and respectful, had dinner with her on Monday, March 31st, and then ate the breakfast she left on the table on Tuesday morning. That evening, however, they didn't make it to dinner. She initially assumed that they had just made some friends and come home late that night, though she did answer a later question about their social lives since their arrival by saying that they spoke very little, if any, Spanish and didn't know anyone because they had just arrived on Saturday. On the other hand, they were young, attractive women in a town popular with European tourists, and it wouldn't be surprising if they'd made some English or Dutch-speaking acquaintances at some point on Tuesday. So, figuring that they were still asleep in their room, she once again left breakfast out for them before heading to work on Wednesday morning. She was very surprised then to receive a call from a local guide named Feliciano, asking if she knew where the girls were. She didn't, and that's when he informed her that the girls hadn't shown up for a scheduled tour, weren't answering the door at the house, and hadn't contacted anyone at Spanish by the River regarding their whereabouts. Miriam couldn't tell the police where the tour guide was supposed to take them, as they hadn't mentioned any plans for that day, and since she barely knew Feliciano, she couldn't recall his last name, she didn't have a frame of reference for which trails and activities he offered. All she knew was that the girls had left behind most of their belongings, including personal hygiene items, their wallets, a good amount of money, and Kris's passport, so it didn't seem like they'd been planning to be gone for more than a day trip. Beyond that, though, all she had to add was that Lisanne seemed to be unwell for the past few days, but it was just a cold. She had also complained of a foot injury at some point over the weekend too, though, so Miriam was doubtful that the girls would have opted to go on any particularly strenuous adventures. Finally, asked if anyone other than Feliciano had inquired about their whereabouts, she said that a girl who worked for the owner of the Spanish language school had, but she couldn't remember her name. That girl's name was Eileen, and like Miriam, she too was asked to sit for a formal interview, conducted at Spanish by the River at noon on April 7th, 2014. Like Kris and Lisanne, Eileen was a European who had only recently arrived in Boquete, about 3 days prior to them, according to Scarlett, but then Scarlett also says that she was on the bus with them on the ride up, so I'm not sure what that is. The way that this blog works is basically that just new information kind of gets added in, but the old information doesn't necessarily get taken out. Point is, it seems like Eileen had met Kris and Lisanne while they were all in Boquete. Like Kris and Lisanne, Eileen was a European who had only recently arrived in Boquete, and she too spoke very little Spanish, despite working for a school with the sole objective of teaching that language. For that reason, the school's owner, Ingrid Lammers, sat in on the interview in order to serve as a translator between her German and Dutch-speaking intern and the Spanish-speaking police. And I should clarify that when the girls went missing, Ingrid was not in Panama. Now, the first information Scarlett provides is that Eileen, like everyone else, was asked if she knew Kris and Lisanne, whether she was friend, enemy, or family member, but her answer to that question was yes, which really isn't an answer to that question. That being said, she did explain that she had met the girls in Bocas del Toro 3 weeks earlier, and beyond that, she was able to confirm that the girls were staying locally with a family, but she had no recollection of them telling her about any plans to take a guided tour in the Boquete region. Her precise words, in answer to the question of whether or not they made plans, communicated through Ingrid, was no, nor did they ask her about any place. And when asked if the girls had ever requested that somebody at the school find a tour guide for them, Eileen once again said no. Specifically, according to Ingrid, she said that she called Feliciano Gonzalez to do a tour for another day, which was April 2nd, and made plans to meet at the school by 8 o'clock in the morning. After that, she explained, they were supposed to head up to La Princesa's farm, with Ingrid clarifying that Eileen didn't actually know where that location was. Now that is a weird series of answers. Eileen didn't recall the girls mentioning any plans, showing interest in going anywhere, or asking about tour guides. And yet she says she called Feliciano on Tuesday to schedule a tour with them for Wednesday. That doesn't make any sense. But unfortunately, the police don't appear to have pressed the issue, which is upsetting, especially because it's not the only time that happened during this particular interview. Asked if the girls mentioned experiencing any problems, Eileen reportedly replied no, and then answered the same way when asked if anyone had approached or contacted the school to ask about Kris and Lisanne prior to Feliciano, and, of course, the answer was no. Police also asked if the girls tended to carry large sums of cash, to which Eileen replied that they only carried what was necessary, before they reached the final question of, is there anything else you'd like to add to your report? Which she answered by saying, that is all. But that wasn't all. The girls were having problems. The primary goal of their trip was the service aspect, with learning Spanish being something of a side quest. With Guarderia Ora turning them away and Casa Esperanza telling them there wasn't any work for them until the following Monday, an entire week of their plans had been erased, and without a proper explanation as to why. Eileen was well aware of those problems when she sat for the interview, and we know that because she was not the only Spanish by the River employee to give an account of those last few days. Though chronologically later than Miriam's testimony, and of an uncertain timing regarding Eileen's, the first of the sources listed on the blog page for this topic is a message from Marjolaine to Ingrid, written somewhere in the first couple of weeks after the girls went missing. As with all of these documents, Scarlett's site doesn't provide the full copy, but she includes a detailed summary of the content, most of which is a recollection of the interactions Marjolaine had with the girls at Spanish by the River prior to their disappearance, and it appears that it was provided at Ingrid's request. Based on the answers given during Eileen's testimony and the fact that Marjolaine refers to March 31st as last Monday, I'm inclined to believe that the document was authored after April 7th, and Scarlett suggests on or shortly after April 9th, due to where it appears in the files. Whatever the case, Marjolaine begins the letter by explaining that Kris and Lisanne had signed up for volunteer work at daycare Guarderia Ora, but that things had gone wrong when they went in to get started on their first day. Marjolaine was responsible for organizing the volunteer work aspect of the experience, and she explained that she had spoken with Maria over at that school on the 28th, and received verbal confirmation that everything was in order. The only remaining step in the process was to schedule the start time for their first day, and Marjolaine reportedly told Maria that she would call her back on Monday, March 31st, to tell her whether Kris and Lisanne wanted to start in the morning or in the afternoon, and if they planned to work full-time or part-time. Marjolaine spoke to the girls about their plans on Sunday, and they told her that they wanted to start at 1 p.m. the very next day. Seeing no issues with this admittedly odd start time for work at a daycare, she told them that it should be possible, and that unless they heard otherwise, they should plan to be at Guarderia Ora the following afternoon. She'd have the school's intern, Eileen, call over to the daycare and get everything lined up, and if there were any problems, she'd contact Miriam to have her tell the girls what was going on. Once Kris and Lisanne left, though, Marjolaine changed her plans, and reportedly decided to go down to Guarderia Ora herself in order to make the arrangements. According to her account, she and Eileen were going to the city center anyway for an appointment at the computer store, so they figured they might as well just stop by the daycare while they were there, though this would have left the school's desk unmanned for at least an hour. Regardless, she said that they arrived around 9:40 a.m., and Marjolaine explains that against expectations, the director told them that Kris and Lisanne could not start that week after all. Apparently because she would not be present much, because she had to go to the city of David a few times, among other things. Marjolaine claims that she protested, citing their agreement from the previous Friday, and told Maria that the change of plans was not good, but the director wouldn't budge. Seeing no luck with Guarderia Ora, Marjolaine gave up and walked over to Casa Esperanza to see if they would be able to take the girls on instead. But she found the coordinator wasn't in, and she was told to try and call back later that afternoon to get a hold of them. Already on quite the losing streak, Marjolaine tried to get Miriam on the phone so she could inform the girls of the plans, only for Miriam to not pick up the phone any of the 3 times she called, probably because she was at work. Frustrating as that was, Marjolaine had other responsibilities, in particular, her own trip to David, so she delegated the task to Eileen instead. As soon as she got back to the school that morning, which should have been around 11 a.m., the intern was to walk over to Miriam's place and let someone know what was going on. That would never happen, though, because as she sat on the bus at that precise time, Marjolaine says she watched Kris and Lisanne climb into the back of a taxi near the bus stop at Plaza San Francisco, heading in the direction of the city center, and almost certainly on their way to what they believed would be their first day of work at the daycare. Marjolaine writes in her letter that she then knew there was little point for Eileen to go to Miriam's place, Scarlett writes, as the girls had already left. So she called Eileen to tell her not to bother with trying to track them down at Miriam's. Instead, she was to perform her normal duties and man the desk until her shift ended at 5:00 p.m., under the assumption that the girls would return to the school when they learned of the situation with the daycare. Later that afternoon, thinking all of that had been handled, Marjolaine called Casa Esperanza again to ask if they had any updates on finding a place for Kris and Lisanne, but all she learned was that the coordinator still hadn't shown up to work, and so she'd have to call again the following day. The whole thing was obviously a mess by this point, but at least Eileen would be able to inform them of what they knew when the girls got back to the school. When she returned to Spanish by the River at 6:30 p.m. that night, however, she found a note from Kris and Lisanne sitting on the bar in the school's hostel. Oddly, that note told her about a second note, this one in the office, in which Kris and Lisanne explained that they had returned from the daycare later that morning and gone back to Spanish by the River as expected, but nobody was there when they arrived. In her letter to Ingrid, Marjolaine expresses confusion as to what happened here, since Eileen was supposed to be on duty until 5 o'clock. And yet the girls had written that they'd sat around at the school all day waiting for somebody to show up, adding that they were sorry about how things had turned out and that they hoped they'd be able to start with the volunteer work soon. Finally, they asked Marjolaine to call them, which she did, but there wasn't much she could tell them that they didn't already know. All she could do was promise to get right on the task of finding them a new volunteer program, but this was in reality a task which once again fell to Eileen. And again, it was because Marjolaine had to go to David, and after that, she had to attend an undescribed emergency in Costa Rica. Before she left, however, Marjolaine told Kris and Lisanne that they needed to be at Spanish by the River by 9 a.m. on Tuesday so that Eileen could meet with them to talk them through the plans for replacement work at Casa Esperanza. Though as we now know, those plans appear to have fallen through as well, as the daycare couldn't take them until April 7th. Altogether, most of the information in the document has nothing to do with the mix-up involving the volunteer work and the failure to communicate what happened there in a timely manner, but Marjolaine also included some yet undisclosed details about Kris and Lisanne's plans when it came to exploring the area. When the girls expressed interest in doing some hiking during the welcome meeting on Sunday, Marjolaine had told them that the school works with a guide, Feliciano, who offers different tours in the region. The girls were particularly enthusiastic about a tour of the Baru volcano, but there were a number of others which caught their attention as well. A coffee tour, a visit to hot springs, and an excursion out to some waterfalls. Marjolaine told them that if they wanted, Feliciano could take them up to Baru, send them out the Sendero de los Quetzales, or even up the Pianista Trail, the last of which she said was the most beautiful shorter hike in the area, taking only about 5 hours in total, and that when they reached the top, if the weather is clear, they could see both oceans, the Caribbean Sea in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean to their west. Once they were done up there, all they had to do was follow the same path back down. Even if they planned to stick to the main trail, however, Marjolaine advised them not to go up without a guide, and said they should make sure to tell her about any plans they had for a guided tour so they could help organize it, which you might notice contradicts something that Eileen said. Anyway, with that, Marjolaine ended her letter by stressing to Ingrid that she'd recounted everything she knew in as much detail as possible, but she suggests that Eileen could still add more details. A fact which suggests to me that she was not aware that Ingrid had already not spoken just to Eileen, but essentially on her behalf when she translated for her during the affidavit. Assuming Marjolaine composed this document sometime during the second week, Ingrid would already have known Eileen's side of the story. Maybe she found Eileen's versions of events and the way she answered questions suspicious. Maybe she just wanted a second account, but whatever the case, it doesn't seem like Marjolaine was aware that Eileen had already testified, or that she'd told a story that didn't quite match up with her own. Regardless of those contradictions between these two accounts, there is one thing that you might have noticed is very consistent throughout this entire story so far. The name Feliciano is all over the place. As we learned in part 1 of this series, Feliciano, referred to as Guide F throughout Jeremy Critt's work for the Daily Beast, is then 58-year-old Feliciano Gonzalez, a well-known tour guide and probably former elementary school teacher who was brought in to give a statement on April 7th. Though it's unclear if this was before, after, or at the same time as Eileen's. When asked about his experience as a guide, he replied that he'd been doing it for roughly 14 years at that point, working primarily in the regions of Boquete, Sinopunta, and Bocas del Toro. As for how he knew Kris and Lisanne, he told police that he had seen them on the morning of Tuesday, April 1st, at Spanish by the River, but that this was the only time he ever saw them. Even then, he hadn't really spoken to them, but rather said hello from afar when he saw them walking by the school that morning. Moving along to the next question, Feliciano confirmed that he frequently took students on his guided tours, and that the two women who booked him for the school were Dutch and German. Police then asked if he had been booked as a tour guide on Tuesday, April 1st for Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, and he answered that the school had booked him for that day, but it was to take Marjolaine and a German couple to David, where he himself had to go for a hospital appointment, not to take the Dutch girls somewhere in or around Boquete. That same day, while I was in David at the hospital, Feliciano said, they, the school, called me and told me that the 2 girls I had observed at the school wanted to go to Mr. Filo's farm in Alto Quiel. Alto Quiel? Probably Quiel. Alto Quiel. And that the tour would be on Wednesday, the next day. It was because he had been booked for this tour that he showed up at the school at 8 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday morning, only to find out that his clients were nowhere to be seen. I told the person in charge of the school, the German, he said, that we should go to the house where they were staying to look for them. According to Feliciano, Eileen, the German in question, agreed, and the 2 of them walked over to Miriam's, where they rang the bell many times without getting an answer. The man went on to explain that the 2 got Miriam's number and tried to contact the host mother that way, though he didn't explain how he got the number until a second interview on June 24th, which we'll be getting to in a moment. If Feliciano is to be believed, Miriam told them that she didn't know if the girls had arrived back at her home the previous night, which was Tuesday evening. Just as she said in her own police interview, she told Feliciano that she stayed up waiting for them until 11 p.m. Police she told 10, but, close enough. But eventually, she had to go to bed because she had to be up and out of the house early for work. And when she had left the house that morning, she hadn't seen them. Feliciano declared that Miriam then told him to knock on the windows of the girls' bedroom, which they did while Eileen called out their names, but there was no response. With no further options, they called Miriam back, and she told them where to find the key so they could go inside and see if the girls were even home. Feliciano told police, "We did what Miss Miriam told us," and when they opened the door, they found Kris and Lisanne's belongings laid out on and beside their beds. But the girls themselves weren't there. Worse still, they left no indication of where they might have gone, so there was no way of knowing if they had stepped out early for some reason and planned to be back, or if they had bailed on the trip entirely. Now, Feliciano said that he waited all day to see if the girls returned, but I think we may have different definitions of all day, because he also described visiting the strawberry farm on their itinerary and a park ranger's booth to ask if anybody had seen them. Finding no luck at either location, however, he returned to Spanish by the River, where they learned that the girls had not shown up in their absence. The last piece of Feliciano's April 7th interview, or at least the last bit that Scarlett covers, involved the possibility that the girls had gone on a guided tour with someone else, perhaps in connection to the question they asked Eileen regarding the girls asking about any other tour guides. Feliciano responded that he was told that they didn't, but he was aware that they had been looking online for information about the Pianista Trail. When told that a taxi driver had dropped the girls off at the trailhead that day, he added that he had heard from a Mr. Lazaro, who lived close to the trail, that members of his family saw 2 young women walk up the trail around 3 p.m. on the day Kris and Lisanne disappeared. Finally, Feliciano added that he and Eileen had gone to the Boquete police station on Wednesday to report the disappearance, ending his statement with, "That is all, I know nothing more about the facts." The truth, however, was that Feliciano hadn't quite told them everything he knew, and on June 24th, about 2 weeks after their backpack turned up, he was called back in for a second formal interview with police. This time, the investigators wanted to know a little bit more about what Feliciano was up to on the day of the disappearance and in those following, before Cineproc showed up in force to take over the search. Once again, Feliciano recounted how he'd gone to David for a hospital appointment that morning, he needed a cast for his pinky finger, and remained there until about 1 o'clock p.m. While there, he received a call from Eileen asking if he remembered the 2 girls who were going to the volcano on Saturday. At that moment, he said, he thought they were going to cancel the trip, but instead Eileen asked if he was free the next day. He told her that he was, and she said that the girls were also interested in visiting the farm of the 2 princesses that he advertised in his brochure. That was fine by him, so they arranged for him to be at the school to meet the girls by 8 a.m., and once it was all set up, Eileen apparently asked if she could join them. First, however, he had to get back from David. After his visit to the hospital, he returned to Boquete that same afternoon, and at some point after he got home, Scarlett writes, Eileen called him to ask for suggestions for volunteer work in Boquete revolving around care for children. And what Feliciano says next is a little confusing. According to Scarlett's coverage, Feliciano said he was able to think of a place that might be suitable, but he didn't know the name of it, which is a bit confusing to read. His exact words, it appears, were, "When I arrived in Boquete that same Tuesday in the afternoon, The German girl called me and asked me if I knew of a place in Boquete where they take care of children. She gave me a name that I don't remember. My belief is that something got lost in translation here, and what Feliciano was actually saying was not that Eileen asked him for suggestions, but rather asked if he knew of a specific place she was looking at by name, and that by June 24th he could no longer remember what name she had given him. Whatever the case, Feliciano reportedly stated that he agreed to drive out to this place and then called Eileen to tell her how to get there, and then ended the call with a sort of "see you tomorrow." Frustratingly, Scarlett does not provide a direct quote from Feliciano here for us to examine, which makes it hard to understand what all of that is supposed to mean. In particular, why did she need Feliciano to drive out to the school? Why did he need to tell her how to get there when she could just pull it up on Google Maps? One possible explanation is that since she didn't speak much Spanish, she asked him to go and inquire if they had a volunteer program. But if that were the case, it doesn't explain why he needed to drive there instead of just calling them, or why he had to give her directions. Something about it just doesn't sound right, and not in a "that's odd behavior" way. I just get the sense that something's left out or potentially misconstrued, especially given what I perceive to be a mix-up with how Scarlett understood the quote about Eileen's call regarding daycare programs. To be quite honest, this is the one major sticking point I have with Scarlett's blog, and I have reached out to ask her if we can maybe collaborate on a way to streamline the vast wealth of information that she presents. Speaking of that information, there's so very much more. The moment I arrived at school at 8 in the morning, Feliciano told police, the German girl was standing outside the school, ready with her small backpack. We spoke for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, and she told me that these girls don't come. They are punctual. In other words, she probably said something along the lines of like, if they're not here, then they're probably not coming because they're so punctual. At which point, Feliciano says he joked that they couldn't be as punctual as Germans. They certainly weren't that day, as after another 5 to 10 minutes, they still hadn't turned up, at which point the guide said they began to grow worried. Familiar with the way things worked at Spanish by the River, Feliciano once again told police that it was his idea to go looking at Miriam's, and that he commonly looks for clients in that house. According to Scarlett, the tour guide told the same story, basically, of what had happened at Miriam's house as what he said in his April 7th affidavit, but there was one little twist. This time, he explained precisely how he got a hold of Miriam's number, which was just by going back to the school to search the computers and the office for it. Once they had the number, Feliciano said that they called Miriam and told her that they had been waiting for Kris and Lisanne for about half an hour, but hadn't seen or heard from them. He then told the same details about Miriam telling them to knock on the bedroom door and subsequently where they could find a key to the house, Scarlett writes, and stated that when they entered the bedroom, they found to their surprise only a few things on the beds and a backpack and sandals on the floor. From this, most likely with regard to the items on the beds, he gathered that the girls had not slept there. This took Miriam by surprise, as she had been operating under the assumption that they had simply come home very late and had even left them breakfast before she went to work that morning. And this differs slightly from the April 7th account, so far as I can tell, in that Feliciano's first statement makes it seem as though Miriam volunteered the information that she hadn't seen the girls come home. The June statement, however, makes it sound as though she had no reason to believe that the girls wouldn't be there that morning, which is something that lines up with her own statement given on April 4th. Additionally, Feliciano's first account doesn't mention breakfast, while the second does, which could suggest either that he just didn't mention it the first time, or that he saw it in the news and then added it back into his story. And unfortunately, Feliciano also does not explain how he could tell that the girls hadn't slept there, simply from the fact that some of their belongings were scattered around their beds. What came after their visit to Kris and Lisanne's room is where things really start to shift away from Feliciano's original narrative, however, as he included a number of new details about the rest of April 2nd. For example, he said that he and Eileen discussed next steps, and that he felt they should call Ingrid. Eileen, on the other hand, worried that Kris and Lisanne could just have some problems, or could have been with friends for the night and just hadn't come back yet for some reason. Both of which are not necessarily good reasons to not call your boss about a couple of missing tourists in her care that hadn't been seen in at least 12 hours, and hadn't contacted anyone since. Still, Feliciano felt that the risk was too great, and argued that they should at least file a missing persons report with the police. But once again, it was Eileen who fought him on this, telling him that in Germany, they normally waited 24 hours before reporting somebody missing. Feliciano also apparently told her that in Boquete they have the same system, rendering it strange that he was advocating for calling the police less than a day after two girls he didn't even know had been last seen, and he seems to have dropped the issue after this. It was at this point, as they continued to chat, that Eileen mentioned the girls had shown interest in the Pianista Trail, and that she'd seen them looking at a map of the area and researching the route on the school's computer. Eileen also said that she understood what they were saying because she had lived in the Netherlands and studied tourism there, whatever that means. Seeing as the tour had still been booked and the farmer had to drive all the way out to the property to guide it anyway, Feliciano suggested that he and Eileen still go and do the tour. Otherwise, the farmer might get mad, and since Feliciano knew him personally, he didn't want to test those waters. If the girls were just out doing their own thing, they'd likely be home by the time Feliciano and Eileen returned, and if they weren't, then it would be time to call the cops. Eileen seems to have agreed to this, as Feliciano next explained that they found this owner on the way to his farm, and also a park ranger who worked at the Alto Chiquero station. The tour guide said that he explained to the owner the reason why they had arrived early, and that 3 girls were not going. And he asked the ranger if he had seen 2 Dutch girls on the trail the day before, in case perhaps they decided to hike out the Quetzales instead of the Pianista. But the tour guide had not seen them. After noon, Scarlett continues, Feliciano and Eileen returned to Spanish by the River and to the house to see if the girls had returned. Unfortunately, they hadn't, and even more unfortunately, Feliciano had to head back to David to visit some friend's house. That's as much as elaboration as we get. If there was anything Eileen needed, however, she was welcome to call him anytime. And as it turned out, she did call him around 5 o'clock p.m., though only to tell him that there had been no news of the girls. And according to Feliciano, when he heard this, he told his friends he needed to get back to Boquete immediately. Eileen spoke very little Spanish, he explained, and he felt the need to go with her in order to help her speak to the authorities. Only when he tried to leave, he realized that he'd left his car key inside of his vehicle. He must have accidentally locked it inside somehow, and he had to wait for his family to bring the spare one all the way down to David, which is about an hour's drive in 2026. On the other hand, I'm not entirely sure if the key problem happened before he left David or after he returned to his home in Boquete. The fact that he apparently went to dinner while waiting for the key suggests the former, but the way everything is written may suggest that it was indeed the latter of the two. Whatever the case regarding the key, Feliciano said that when he and Eileen arrived at the police station that night, the cops said they needed Kris and Lisanne's identification documents in order to process the report. The officer at the station tried to find another cop to head back to Miriam's with them to get the documents, but he couldn't find one, so he sent Feliciano and Eileen back alone, making it twice that these 2 individuals were alone with Kris and Lisanne's belongings before any investigators saw the room. This second time into the room, Miriam helped them sift through the girls' belongings to find their IDs, but all they found in the room was a small photo ID card for one of the girls. The rest of the information had to be obtained from the documents held by the school, but it was enough for them to file the report and get things moving. According to Feliciano, the police officer who assisted them said that he had reached out to Cineproc the next day to relay the information and to get them involved in the search, though, as we know, they didn't actually arrive at any significant scale until April 6th. From there, Feliciano said that Eileen was instructed to wait at Spanish by the River on Thursday in case the girls returned or someone tried to contact the school about their whereabouts, while Feliciano received a call from the feds to come in and provide a report in person. Feliciano then told police that during his interview with Cineproc, he gave them all the same information he'd given to the Boquete police, and that they asked if he'd be willing to guide their people up the Pianista himself. He was, and after a quick trip home to change his clothes, he met them at the point where the Pianista Trail enters the forest. Once there, he requested that Cineproc give him their fastest walker to accompany him to the route which separates before the place of Mr. Lazaro, continuing to the Horqueta area. Frankly, this entire section is extremely confusing because Google Maps does not suggest that any of these places are where they should be based on the story. The only thing I can point to with 100% certainty is where the trail enters the forest, because that's a pretty easy delineation from a map. The confusing part is that there's a bit about them before getting over there, driving up to the Arco Iris district, which so far as I can tell is where the Boquete Cineproc office is located. So maybe he went down to David to give his statement that morning and then came back up, but it really seems like he was talking to the Cineproc office in Boquete, and the Horqueta area is a complete wash for me. Like, the only spot I found matching that name is nowhere near where the trail enters the forest, nor does it really look like there is a way to get there from the Pianista Trail. All that aside, after spending about 10 minutes looking for a spot with good enough reception so he could call the Cinnabrock people, for reasons not explained at this time, Feliciano ended up getting a call himself from the higher-ups at the organization, asking him to return to base to wait for orders as they were organizing their own search group. This, he said, upset all the Cinnabrock people already on the ground because they considered it a precious waste of time. Still, all of them obeyed the order, but Feliciano, having no need to follow it, continued up the trail. On his own, the guide hiked up the Pianista for an hour, but it was to no avail. He saw no sign of the girls, and so next he hiked out to Mr. Lazaro's place to ask if he or his family had seen anything. Based on everything said throughout this segment, I suppose we must conclude that the Lazaro property is somewhere along the Pianista Trail, between the trailhead and the Mirador. Mr. Lazaro, he was told, had seen 2 women go up there on Tuesday, but he hadn't seen them come down. One wore shorts, Feliciano learned, but the other couldn't be seen well from where Lazaro was standing at the time. Though not a full confirmation, it was enough for Feliciano to continue working his way up the trailhead, and he spent the next hour hiking down the eastern side of the slope towards Bocas del Toro province. He kept going until he reached a point known as Alejandro Pitti, which he explained is where there is another route that deviates to where the Saracen family lives, or the Saracen family, I guess. This also just occurred to me. Technically, we're kind of out of what I have designed for the story here, but later we're going to hear that some witnesses saw the girls with a dog named Blue, who was basically just a gray version of this. Yeah. You want to say hi to the people? Yeah. Blue's a husky. Thank you. Feliciano would later explain how to get to the area of Alejandro Pitti, stating that you walk up the Pianista Trail and that the road divides before the place of Mr. Lazaro, and from then on, you continue to the right and on a single road to the mountain range for 2.5 to 3 hours. With regard to what routes existed to reach this location, he said, there is only one way, which is the Pianista. There is no other, and that is the one you use. Gonna be honest, I have tried to figure out how all of that works, but until I get at least one of these places nailed down, I have no idea what to make of that. It's very confusing that he says he went to Mr. Lazaro's and then continued to a place that apparently you reach before you get to Mr. Lazaro's. So I'm thinking, again, it's gotta be a translation issue here. And I don't have the original files, so I'm getting a Dutch woman's translation of Spanish written in English. That is, by the way, not a dig at Scarlett at all. She has done an incredible amount of work. It's just, I don't know. I don't know if this is something where, like, the word in Spanish didn't translate into Dutch well, or the Dutch didn't translate into English well. But just something about the way she describes that, even if you read the entire her version of it, it's very difficult to comprehend what it means. Anyway, once at Alejandro Pitti, Feliciano considered going further, he said, but by then it was noon and he was getting tired. He also realized that if he were to continue to hike further down, he would also be late for a booked tour with 14 Norwegians for that night to Baru Volcano, for which he wanted to rest a bit first. So, with few options, he opted to turn around and head back to Boquete, where he spoke to several other people who claimed to have seen 2 girls go up the trail on Tuesday. And none of those people recalled seeing the girls come down. Feliciano told police that he brought the information he'd gathered back to Cinnabrock and showed them which points on the map he'd visited during his solo trek that morning. And lastly, he told them that he'd be available to help again beginning Friday at noon. Following up with that statement, it appears that the police asked him if he made himself available to Cinnabrock to initiate a search for the Dutch girls, or if he was asked to do so, and he replied that he made himself available, but that they never contacted him or asked him to participate in any search. He also clarified that his trek to Alejandro Pitti was of his own volition, as the Cinnabrock man with him had returned to base at that point. And he clarified that once past the Mirador, he hadn't seen anyone else, so he was unable to ask about the girls. And that comment makes figuring out where all of these people and places are even more confusing, especially because Scarlett says that he reported speaking with somebody at the Lazaro household, but so far as I can tell, the Lazaro household should be on the western side, so that makes it sound like it's on the eastern side, so I don't even know who's confused now. I'm confused about who's confused. Am I confused because somebody else was confused, or am I confused just because I'm confused? Whatever the case, after this set of questions, the police transitioned over to inquiries about Feliciano himself. Asked about his qualifications as a trail guide, the man answered that he is a certified local and regional tourist guide. With regard to his work with Spanish by the River, he said that the school calls him to guide some tourists who are interested in taking tours to the volcano, a claim which could be corroborated by numerous other tourist-related locations who also hired him. He further confirmed that he did take payment for his work, that he had about 14 years of experience in the field, and that he'd never had a problem with anyone he'd worked with. As for where he took people other than the volcano, he said that he only offered a handful of tours to places including the Pianista Trail, the Quetzal Trail, the Baru Volcano, occasionally the hidden waterfalls and some waterfalls owned by the Landau family, and occasionally the hot springs or for horseback riding at the Franklin Rovetto Farm. You will notice he does not mention the strawberry farm. Do you think anybody pushed him on that? No, they didn't. When I say that the way Panama and the Dutch handled the police investigation aspect of this case makes me grateful for the FBI. I don't think that that's, I am hard on the FBI quite a bit. When I say that it makes me grateful for the FBI, I don't think that that's quite enough. I would rather have the RCMP looking for me. Forget the FBI. They're actually pretty good at what they do in general. They just have a few major screw-ups. The RCMP is god-awful at their jobs because they just don't care. But I get the sense that if they did care, they could succeed. Nobody is... You're screwed. If you go missing, do not expect the police to successfully interrogate anybody. In Panama, apparently. The guides are great at finding people. When people get lost on the trails, the guides are great at finding them. Apparently, if they can't, it's over. Anyway, while he did acknowledge that he'd picked clients up from Miriam's house in the past, he denied contacting her personally in order to book new ones, stating that he only knew her from sight and that they are not friends, and that the only times he ever went to her house were when he was supposed to meet a client there, which once again, I'm skeptical because she gave him her key, which seems like a lot of trust considering the relationship they're both describing. He also said that he wasn't the only guide Spanish by the River uses, but then tempered that by saying he didn't know if they had another person for that purpose at that time. Asked about the Pianista itself, he said that tourists needed to be in good physical condition for it, and commented that Germans, Canadians, Dutch, and Swiss are very good at climbing. I would say it's odd that he doesn't include Americans in that grouping, as we have a vibrant hiking and climbing culture here, but other sources have mentioned that Feliciano either did not or does not like Americans, so that might account for it. All of that said, the biggest difference between the April 27th and June 24th affidavits is not to be found amongst Feliciano's answers, but rather the circumstances surrounding the interview as a whole. When he first came in, the girls were newly missing. Now that they had been found, there were questions about the possibility of foul play again, and police needed to rule out people as frequently as possible. When asked where and with whom he was on June 18th and 19th, 2014, Scarlett writes, Feliciano replies that he was in Alto Romero, and answered follow-ups about why he was there and what he was doing by explaining that the Dutchman Mr. Geronimo, Jeroen van Passel, or Van Passel, I'm not good with Dutch, guys. That's who it was according to Scarlett. The Dutchman Mr. Geronimo asked for his services for the families, given that he knew the Culebra River and the area where the backpack was found well. From the outset, Feliciano was apparently concerned about whether or not his agreement to assist Van Passel would cause any misunderstandings with the authorities or the prosecutor's office, as he could see how they might perceive this as interference. But he said that the Dutchman had replied there was no problem and that the authorities were aware of it. To that end, he obtained the services of his brother, Jose Domingo Gonzalez, and a Mr. Loriano Bejarano, as well as a number of indigenous locals who agreed to help in exchange for food and or money. Regarding his own payment, Feliciano reported that when the searches concluded, Van Passel insisted upon paying him $150, but made it clear that he hadn't signed on for the money in the first place. Like, the money was not why he agreed to help out. No, he simply wanted to help from the very beginning, not only because he felt that it was part of his job as a guide, but also because he had his own property in the area and was concerned about what was happening. He also explained that because he was so familiar with the area, Van Passel wanted him to search further downstream from the point where the backpack was found, and then further upstream in search of any clues as to the girl's path in the days following their disappearance. Feliciano was asked if he documented this search, to which he said he did, in the form of a sketched map of the places he traveled through, and in addition through some of the photos that were shown on TVN, which he took. When asked about his property in Alto Romero, the guide said that it was in the Velorio sector, but that he only visited a few times a year because he was afraid of the river crossings or the cables, which are dangerous. And I'm going to tell you right now, just keep that little bit of information in the back of your mind. He also said that in his absence, which was of course most of the year, he paid an indigenous person to look after the property. In fact, he employed a significant number of the people living in and around Alto Romero, and appears to be an influential man in the little indigenous community, but we'll get into more details about that in part 3. It was about this point in the writing process that I realized there was absolutely no way I was getting the rest of this story done in one video. I'm not trying to drag this out. This took 3 weeks, writing this. So, on the one hand, I just didn't have the time to get through all the information I needed to get through. And on the other hand, I don't know how long this video is yet, but it probably would have been twice as long. So, bite-sized pieces. Eventually, the police got around to asking if he realized that authorities from Cineproc, the public prosecutor's office, the National Police, and Cine Front were in that area, and if Feliciano thought that the conduct of his search could cause or generate any kind of doubt or error in the activities carried out by the authorities. The answer to this should have been yes, but Feliciano replied no, and reasoned that whenever authorities started their own search, which they could do whenever they wanted, Feliciano himself could simply leave that same day. When asked if he wanted to add anything else, Feliciano stated that he believed the government should put up better signs on the Pianista Trail to warn about the dangers of that area, and with that, the interrogation session came to an end, and the document was signed by First Superior Prosecutor Miss Betsaida Piti de Castillo. A better prosecutor would have noticed the things she didn't. Throughout the affidavits given by Eileen, Marjolaine, and Feliciano, these witnesses repeatedly contradict one another, and sometimes even themselves. And while I wouldn't say that the degree to which this happens is uniform, it is undeniably an issue with all three. That being said, I do want to quickly take a minute and go over a couple of things mentioned in Miriam's accounts that struck me as either odd or important. First and foremost is the fact that she allowed Feliciano into her home, essentially unsupervised, despite telling police she really only knew the man in passing. I mean, she tells us that she didn't know his last name, and yet she trusts him enough to let him into her house. And here's the thing, I could see that as maybe being the case if it were Marjolaine or Ingrid accompanying him. But it was Eileen, a girl even less familiar to her than Kris and Lisanne, and just as recent an arrival. Now granted, there are probably some cultural differences between, where I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania and rural Panama, but just, that doesn't seem right. Something strikes me as off about that. I don't know precisely what yet. I have a few theories about what could have happened here, but I'm not confident that any one of them is correct yet, so I'm gonna hold off. But like I said, part 3 is coming, and I'm gonna admit it, I kind of ran out of time while writing this and did not finish writing whatever the next thing in the script is. The gist is that an article from June 26, 2014 reported that Miriam told the press that she got home that afternoon, talked to the girls about the daycare, and that afternoon being Monday afternoon, the 31st, talked to the girls about the daycare. Lisanne said that they had gone, but they hadn't had an opportunity to start, and that they'd even told her she wouldn't have the opportunity to work that week at all. At which point, Miriam said that she asked them if they knew about Casa Esperanza, which is another place that provides the same work, as she put it, and they answered that they had found out, but that it was full. What this suggests is that the diary entries that Kris and Lisanne wrote, where they talk about waiting to find out what's going to happen at Casa Esperanza, were written at some point between leaving the note at Spanish by the River and having dinner with Miriam. And if that were the case, then the girls would have known that they didn't need to stop by Spanish by the River at 9 o'clock the next morning in order to find out what the next steps were towards working at Casa Esperanza. And yet, according to an April 9th statement from a neighbor who lived near the school, Veronica S., the girls were over there at or just before 9 in the morning. Why? It could very well be that that was just the start time for their lessons at Spanish by the River. That would explain why they decided to start in the afternoon. But then again, if their day at Spanish by the River started at 9 a.m. every day, then why would Marjolaine need to tell them to be there at 9 a.m.? Or why would Marjolaine be asking when they want to start at Guardia Hora? No matter which way you look at this, it doesn't work. By the way, Veronica also said that Lisanne was the only one who spoke any Spanish whatsoever, and she said that after observing Lisanne at 9, she didn't see her more because she was very busy. And it's unclear what that means, or if she actually spoke to the girls that morning, because in an earlier statement, she said that she saw them around 11:30 on Monday, and in that case, she used the specific phrase, "That day I did greet them." Although, as I've said several times, this could be a lost in translation kind of issue, and it could be like, that day I greeted them, or I saw them that day, and basically it might not look quite as disqualifying of her seeing them on Tuesday in Spanish. That is, as of right now, for the most part, really the only issue I have with Miriam's statements. Marjolaine, however, oh boy. Marjolaine told Ingrid that she called Guarderia Hora to book the volunteer work on Friday, March 28th, 2014, that she confirmed the girls were okay to start on March 1st, and that all they would need to do from there was secure a starting time. There are multiple problems with what Marjolaine said here, the first of which is that it completely contradicts what Kris wrote in her diary. According to her, when the daycare sent them home and said there was no work for them there, the school also found it very strange because they had planned it months in advance. So, did they lie to Kris and Lisanne and tell them it was planned in advance, and then they planned it the Friday before they got there? That's not the only thing that doesn't work with this aspect of the story, though, and Scarlett says if Marjolaine and Maria confirmed with each other on Friday the 28th that the volunteer work would start on Monday the 31st, then what was there to confirm again on Monday? Marjolaine said that it was about asking the girls what time they wanted to start their first day, but why wait until that very day to make those plans? And also, if they wanted to start in the morning, what time would they have had to communicate that? Then we have the issue of how Marjolaine described her plan to contact the girls after they told her they wanted to start in the afternoon. Why on earth would she decide, when the school is 800 feet from their beds, that the best way to contact them about whether or not they'd actually be able to start that day would be to call a woman who was not there, Miriam, just so that she could call Kris and Lisanne to relay the info? Why would Marjolaine not just call them herself? If she didn't have their number, she could have asked for it. If it was about poor cell reception or them keeping their phones in airplane mode when not connected to Wi-Fi in order to avoid roaming charges, as has been suggested, then Miriam would not have been able to reach them either. It's all just so needlessly complicated, and there is no conceivable reason to pick that strategy, that system, over the option of just having them stop by to ask what the plan was. Or at the very least be in a place where they could definitely receive calls. And it would have been very easy for them to find a place where they could receive calls because it was literally right in front of them. They were 800 feet from the school. The school had Wi-Fi. Besides, the whole being worried she wouldn't be able to reach them thing, it just doesn't work as an explanation, because Marjolaine said that the reason she didn't call them when she saw them headed downtown on Monday morning was that it was too windy on the bus to make a phone call. And she figured they'd find out what's going on soon enough anyway, and she'd give them a call later that night when she got back to Boquete. All of which would suggest that there was literally no reason for her to go through Miriam in order to contact them about the school. If she said the reason I didn't call them is that they kept their phones on airplane mode, that makes sense. If she said the reason I didn't call them is I didn't have their number, that makes less sense, but it still makes sense. The reason I didn't call them is that it was windy on the bus tells us that that calling them was always an option. In the same vein, I have to wonder what was going through Marjolaine's head when she put a girl who didn't speak Spanish in charge of calling a local Spanish-speaking daycare to inquire about volunteer work for 2 other girls who also didn't speak Spanish. It just doesn't make sense. So I think the explanation here may be that Eileen didn't speak enough Spanish to perform the task, necessitating Marjolaine's involvement. Maybe she really did have an appointment at the computer store, but that also could have just been an excuse intended to prevent Ingrid from thinking that she was incompetent as a manager, even though bringing Eileen along for the trip and leaving the school's front desk unmanned strikes me as very incompetent. But that being said, she may or may not have actually brought Eileen along. At least that's what Eileen suggested to the authors of Still Lost in Panama a couple of years ago, and while Eileen's accounts certainly have some issues, it would appear that a statement given by Maria, the owner and operator of Guarderia Ora, actually supports her claim. Speaking to the authors, Maria told police that aside from Kris and Lisanne themselves, only 1 foreigner had come in that morning. But that's not all. In a statement made to police on April 10th, 2014, Maria not only said that she didn't offer internships or volunteer positions and hadn't done so in at least 3 years, but also that she didn't even know what Spanish by the River was, nor did she know of any Ingrid Lummers. This, however, appears to contradict what Lisanne wrote in her diary, namely that Maria told them no próxima semana, or no next week. Kris also wrote that they couldn't start yet and that there was no work for them this week, suggesting that Maria told the girls something completely different than what she told police. On the other hand, the girls didn't speak Spanish, so it could very well be that they just didn't understand her properly. While we're on the subject of Eileen, we still don't seem to have an answer about where she was when Kris and Lisanne showed up on the afternoon of March 31st after being turned away by the daycare. According to Marjolaine, Eileen had been instructed to return to the school and man the desk until the end of her shift at 5 p.m., or at least until Kris and Lisanne got back, and to explain what the next steps would be for finding more volunteer work. If that was the case, why did Kris and Lisanne have to leave notes? Had Eileen left early? Had she ever returned to the school at all? So far as I can tell, she's never publicly explained what she was actually up to all that day, or why Marjolaine said what she did in her letter to Ingrid. It's also true that Eileen's affidavit doesn't specify when she last saw the girls, at least so far as the coup de cas summary suggests. But we now know that she told Cineproc on April 3rd that she'd last seen the girls around 1:00 p.m. on Tuesday, and she confirmed that she had been at the school on Tuesday in a Facebook message thread with a couple of internet sleuths from Canada. However, she told those same 2 sleuths that the last time she saw the girls was actually on Monday, March 31st. Now, she has since told interviewers that it was indeed Tuesday, which is not the end of the inconsistencies with her version of events. Eileen also told police that she wasn't aware of the girls experiencing any problems, but that wasn't really the case. In reality, the girls were very much experiencing problems with their planned volunteer work, and not only was she actively aware of that, but she was literally tasked with fixing the problem herself. I also can't wrap my head around Eileen's failure to tell the police that the girls were discussing hiking the Pianista when asked if she had anything more to add at the end of the interview on the 7th, especially because she mentioned that trail by name to Cineproc on April 3rd and to an American blogger on April 4th. More importantly, she explicitly said while speaking to police on the 7th that the girls hadn't discussed any plans to go hiking or any interest in doing so with her, guided or otherwise. If that's the case, then why did she call Feliciano to book a tour for Wednesday? Was this her way of keeping the girls occupied for the week? Was this her idea? Or was she following someone's orders? Even if we accept that it was Tuesday morning by the time the girls came in and asked her to book something for them, she's still lying about something here, and we don't know why, because she told the police they didn't approach her. So why'd she call? And that brings us to Feliciano. What about his role in all of this? Well, the man told police that he'd only ever seen Kris and Lisanne once, and that it was very early in the morning on the day they went missing. Based on his various retellings of the story to the police and the media, as well as Marjolaine's account, this likely would have been before 7:00 a.m. on Tuesday, outside of Spanish by the River, where he was most likely waiting to pick up Marjolaine. The thing is, Jeremy Critt, who again wrote the Daily Beast series on this case, has repeatedly stated that witnesses told him they saw Feliciano speaking with the girls less than 24 hours before they disappeared. And that would seem to contradict the guide's claims that all he said to them was hello, and that he said it from afar. And even just looking at what he said happened that morning, there appears to be another glaring inconsistency. The German couple. If you'll recall, Feliciano said that he was scheduled to take a German couple down to David with him, and that it was the school who booked him to do so. The problem with this story is that according to everything I found on this case so far, there was only one other student at the school besides Kris and Lisanne at the time, and she was from Liechtenstein. While I could certainly see a Panamanian identifying somebody from Liechtenstein as German, there is not a good explanation for his description of being booked to take a couple. It's also just sort of nonsensical on the whole. If Feliciano was going to David for a hospital appointment, as he said, and didn't leave the hospital until the early afternoon around 1 o'clock, when did he have time to guide a tour? I suppose it is possible that the man was only hired to drive them down, or that they were supposed to be staying in the city and coming back another day, but it doesn't look like the police really pressed for more information. Then there's the whole issue of when he said he left David, which was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This isn't so much contradiction as it is a questionable coincidence, because that's precisely the same time Eileen gave for when she last saw the girls when speaking to Cineproc on April 3rd, just 2 days after the disappearance. Also a little suspect are Feliciano's self-reported actions from April 3rd. First, he wanted to report everything immediately, but it took almost no pushback from Eileen to convince him that they should wait. Then, suddenly, it's fine to wait several more hours, because if they don't go on the planned tour for that day, the farmer might get upset. I mean, as long as he was still getting paid, I kind of doubt that. It should also be said that while Feliciano's initial concern seems admirable, the fact that he continued to insert himself into the case over and over again, and was somehow always right there when something important happened, is a little suspicious from a profiling standpoint. Being the one who realized that they were missing because he was booked to guide them on a tour is one thing. But being the one who realized and reported that they were missing, offering to guide Cineproc's people up the very trail they had taken, owning land next to where their remains were found, being the employer of the people who found those remains, and leading the indigenous search party which discovered those remains, that's all a bit much. Now, as I said earlier, I originally planned for this episode to be the end of the series. That it was just going to be part 1 is this what you know, part 2 is what you probably didn't. Unfortunately, what you know is about 4% of the sum total of information. I did not know that when I set out to do this. I have made my way through most of Kudikas. I have collected a lot of information. I have 200 more pages of notes. And I am reasonably confident that part 3 will be the final part. There are 2 primary things I want to cover in part 3, and those are the revelations from the camera and the cell phones, and then also a rather well put together theory about who could be responsible for this, and the major glaring flaw in that theory. And, I mean, hopefully, if all goes well, maybe I'll have an idea about what happened. Maybe we'll get there. Last time we presented a law enforcement agency with a very clear-cut explanation of why somebody was an obvious suspect. They did nothing with it, so, I will get you, Kris Proudfoot. And by I will get you, I mean that I will convince the police to properly investigate you, and nothing else. For legal reasons. I'm serious, I'm being genuine, but like, for legal reasons, I gotta be clear about that. Well, all that being said, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all those things. Leave a comment, tell people that you loved it, tell people that you hated it. I don't care. I do. Please be nice. And if you want to be super duper nice and support the channel directly with a financial contribution, we've made it really easy to give us $1 a month. You just go on Patreon, you sign up at the $1 a month level, and then you get ad-free versions of the episodes, a few other exclusive goodies. Our other employee, has now also been sent to the basement, just for a short period of time. We don't keep anybody locked down there permanently, but he's been sent down to the basement until he finishes uploading all of the scripts to the Patreon, so we'll see how that goes. You get those too, and we got some other fun stuff cooking. We know that we don't offer a ton over there, mainly for a lack of time. which is why there's a $1 tier. But if you're looking for something a little bit more physical, a little bit less ephemeral, you can actually get our merch. It's over on the floor. Before it was on the floor, however, it was in a bunker branding warehouse, and then on a truck, and then in a apartment that I live in, and then on me. Or if you'd like to just like taste my essence, I guess, something like that, get our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company, Mount Pocono Perk, and I designed it myself. And not in the sense that I was like, hey, give me that one and put my branding on it. In the sense that I told them I wanted Ethiopian Yagirachev at 405 degrees, along with other things for, notes of citrus and earth. Because I know what I'm talking about when it comes to coffee. If you're gonna buy a creator's coffee, buy ours. Like seriously. Buy ours. Instead of a dig at other creators, it's just our coffee is better than theirs. Now, if you're looking to get more Lodge, the best way to stay on top of that is to join our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge, and to, of course, subscribe, hit the notification bell on our other channels, which you can find at History Unhinged, Silver Retention, Aiden Mattis, Lore on Location, and the Lore Lads, and also the Weird Bible, which things are in the oven. We've got more guests coming up for that. It's coming back, boys and girls. And of course, if you would like to catch our American Monsters series going over the most heinous crimes by the most heinous of people in America, maybe it'll expand once I run out of Americans. If you'd like to catch that, it is a Pepperbox exclusive, so you can head over there where you can watch our videos from this channel, our exclusive series, and your favorite creators from all over the place in one convenient place on a streaming service. And a streaming service which has much better RPM than this one. All right, with all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.